Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nature Source Care. My name is Dr. Flynn Goldman. In today's talk, I was going to discuss homeopathy for chronic discontent, and specifically the Bach Flower remedy crabapple. So let's take a look at what we've got today. A note beforehand, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For any symptoms that persist or worsen, please consult with a qualified medical professional. It's always best to determine the root cause of any disease and to develop a comprehensive treatment plan. And while homeopathy or Bach flower remedies can be very effective, they may not be appropriate for everyone or as a single therapy. So, again, with the topic we're talking about today, there can be other factors involved with somebody who's, quite unsatisfied with life. So again, this might just be one tool to consider as part of a complete treatment plan. All right, so just a few words about Bach flower remedies and homeopathy in general, especially if you're not familiar. So, homeopathy is a kind of energy medicine. It's an energy medicine paradigm. So, the remedies are based on different energies, and Bach flower remedies are parts, sort of a subset of homeopathy. Okay, so if you want more background or history on Bach flower remedies, I would check out my first Bach flower remedy video on Walnut for new beginnings. So the general concept, though, for Bach flower remedies is that disease stems from an internal struggle of some kind. And I found Bach flower remedies to be really helpful with mental, emotional, and spiritual conditions in my practice. Okay. So for more videos like this, I have a Bach flower remedies playlist, and I've gone through, made videos on almost all of the Bach flowers. I think I only have 5 left after this one. So it's almost a complete course in itself, that playlist. So again, if you want to learn about the Bach flowers, I would check that out. So the keynote for this particular remedy about crabapple is that somebody who's never, content or satisfied. And the inner state of being that's related to this is like not feeling good enough. Like not feeling good enough in self, not feeling good enough about life, not feeling good enough about, circumstances. So let's take a look at that, break that down a little bit more. So like, what are crabapple symptoms? Like, how would you identify somebody who might be helped by this remedy? Well, again, they're chronically unhappy, discontent, unsatisfied, and crabby. I mean, that's a term we use, right? Crabby, like they're always sort of on the negative side of things, always looking on the nitpicking things. Even when things are objectively going very well, or a kind of a highlight, they'll find something to kind of bring that energy down. Okay. So again, they might kind of come across as somebody who's like perfectionistic or hypercritical or rigid even, because they have certain standards that are never being met, or, they nitpick things to death, or they just, focus on the negative rather than the positive, even if there's a lot of positive to be looked at. So, this can get fairly dark, especially for the individual, especially when they turn this energy on themselves. So there can be like self-loathing, self-disgust, this feeling of being unclean, or even something like, dysmorphia of different kinds, like body dysmorphia, where, even if they're people who suffer from this kind of mismatch between their perception of themselves, especially their physical self, and, maybe how other people might, or most people might see them, is quite a bit different. Excuse me for a second. Okay, sorry about that. I suddenly had a coughing fit. So anyway, yeah, again, this energy can be turned inwardly and be quite destructive, and create like a body dysmorphia for some people. So, again, they're going to come across as like pretty pessimistic, kind of a downer type of person or personality, or conversations they have always tend towards the negative. Um, they can also like, this can coincide or seem like other types of issues related to mental health, like obsessive compulsive disorder, or again, the compulsion is to always focus on the negative, or to be perfectionist about things, like when things aren't in a particular order. And maybe one, just even with physical things, if you have 5 different glasses and one is just off by a millimeter or two, some people will catch that and focus on that, and then have to like correct it, kind of compulsively correct it, that kind of thing. They tend to be quite sensitive, especially to details of different things. And this might even show up as like a hypochondriac type of situation where, again, any little thing that niggles them becomes this kind of bigger deal that needs to, pulls in a lot of energy of theirs and other people's and their attention and their mind and that sort of thing. So the other thing, how this can kind of show up is through other people because they tend to be this way. Other people around them might feel like, or even do so, is they might walk around on eggshells around this person because they know this person is, pretty detail oriented and always kind of upset about things and never quite satisfied. So some people might try to, build them up or boost them up or, cheer them up, try to get them to see things in a more positive way, both for the sake of the person who's kind of experiencing this, but also the people around them, because, again, that kind of energy can be kind of contagious. We feel other people's negative energy. But the thing is, like, some people will do the other. Well, they'll sort of tiptoe around and try to accommodate, this really kind of a pretty strong focus on never being satisfied. So, yeah, because it's just such a strong energy, people around them kind of adapt in different ways to deal with it, best they can. Some people might just walk away, because they can't deal with the negativity that seems to be prevalent. And again, this person tends to focus on details and adjust, like sort of compulsively adjust those sorts of details. They can't just like notice and walk away. They notice, they talk about it, and then they do something, you know, um, maybe even compulsively in that moment to adjust. And it kind of like gets them hung up, in certain energy patterns and thought patterns. So, if they're walking down the street and they notice something out of order that disturbs them, like they might have to change their path or spend time, correcting that so that they can move forward. And again, that's just like a small analogy for like just walking down the street, but it's kind of like as they walk down the street of their life, this can really hang them up in certain energy patterns. They're not productive or happy. And so by focusing, sort of almost hyper focusing and, um, sort of addressing these detail issues, they often lose sight of the bigger picture of things. Okay. And again, like you're getting the probably gist here is that they tend to make a big deal or a mountain out of a molehill, where other people can be like, oh, it's not perfect, but good enough, and oh, it's 98% there, but this person will get hung up on that 1 or 2% that's not quite snuff. This person can also like engage in different, external activities like extreme cleaning or decluttering or minimalism, to help them reduce the amount of, details that are out of order. Right. Also, this can develop into something that has like religious implications or a tone to it in terms of like, not living up to some sort of religious ideal or being impure, from a religious standpoint, so that can happen as well. Actually, one of the patients I gave this to is comes, she comes from a fairly traditional family, and she ended up getting pregnant when she was pretty young as a teenager, before she got married. And this was a big no-no in her family, and her family was really concerned. They didn't want anybody to know about it, or they didn't want it to happen because they were concerned about their own kind of, status or how other people would see them in the community and that sort of thing. So apparently, an older sibling and the parents, or father at least, basically convinced her, you might even say forced her to get an abortion, okay, when she was young to deal with this. And when she was in my office, she was one of these people, like, no matter what you said, she always found the negative point. She would always focus on that. And then at some point, and she was coming to my office for a while, and I was just like, wow, why is she like so negative all the time? Like, it was pretty obvious. Um, and then one day we were talking, and then that story popped up about how her family, whatever language you want to use, encouraged, coerced, forced her to have an abortion when she was a teenager. for again, not wanting to fall out of, a positive view with the religious community. That came up, and then because she shared that story with me, I gave her crabapple, and the next time she came in, you could see that her energy shifted, like her face, the expression on her face was lighter. She was laughing a bit. Um, when we would have a conversation, instead of shooting down every idea I shared with her, um, she was like, yeah, that's a possibility. And it was pretty dramatic because she'd consistently come in with just, again, everything was fairly negative. So, that's just one case where that remedy really helped quite a bit. And again, even for long-standing issues, because uh, when I gave her that remedy, she was close to retirement age, so in her 60s, and the abortion happened in her teenage years. So again, these Bach Flower remedies can be quite helpful, for kind of unusual situations that seem to be chronic, or like again with her, it just seemed like a personality trait. But after I gave her that crabapple remedy, the fact that her energy shifted, I was like, I don't think this is her personality. I think this is some, you know, especially when you're young, you don't have the mental or emotional capacity. You just sort of accept what the people around you are doing, and because they're older, or your parents, and you listen to them, you're respecting them, or whatever. But if part of the story, and again, I wasn't there for any of these conversations with their parents or family, but if part of the conversation was like, this is a, unclean act, or, sinful act, or whatever language is used, she might have really deeply internalized that, you know. And then also, I know women who, even if they're not encouraged by their family to get an abortion, they do feel the impact of, getting pregnant and deciding to end the pregnancy and that sort of thing. So, I think that sometimes those sorts of activities can kind of be talked about lightly, but what I've seen with people is that there is a deeper impact for the women who have that experience in terms of the way that they feel about, the pregnancy being terminated, and about themselves, and about, their spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs, relationship with family and others. It kind of opens up a whole Pandora's box a lot of times. So anyway, that's just one example, but um, again, other people might remain distant to them to, basically avoid them, or they may also avoid, certain situations because they just don't want to deal with, on some level they realize it's really taxing for them, energy draining for them, or may I don't know if they do it for them. They probably do it for themselves more than others, but because they're so focused on these details, they may avoid a lot of situations just to avoid the mental stress of getting hung up on them. Um, and again, this person, they tend to lose objectivity. It's more of a compulsive, like hyper focusing, and then they lose sight of the big picture. Like, what's the real objective here? What's the real goal here? For this activity, or this day, or this month, or that sort of thing. And also, like, especially when they get into the more, self-condemning aspects of this energy, they're really missing this, general point of just loving yourself unconditionally, and being your own best friend and own best supporter in life. So they really take it out on themselves, and that drags them down even further. It kind of creates a negative spiral. The other thing is that this kind of behavior might develop kind of like or from some experience in childhood where maybe the adults around them or people around them were really hyper focusing on how looks or performance determine somebody's value. And so, it might be, again, experience from the past, or even, even so far as like the past childhood, where somebody picked up other people's values and is trying to adhere to them, or and never feels like they quite reach those standards, or meet those standards, and so then this energy kicks in with the negativity. So the risk again of not addressing these sorts of negative mental loops is that somebody can get held back in life because they again end up sort of spending all their time, energy, vital force on trying to sort out these details, um, and then again getting caught up in this loop of negativity within themselves, with others, that kind of thing. So the potential outcome for taking a remedy like this is to start being somebody who can like go with the flow more, and not kind of expecting or trying to create some perfect self or life. And again, perfection is always like, subjective anyway, right? So, and then again, hopefully less stress in terms of, having more time, energy, lightness of being, being more accepting of self, life, circumstances, and also like finding, developing better connections with people where it's not just all negative all the time. And there might be, when they take this remedy, actually something that might happen is that they might kind of lose connections initially because if their relationships are focused or developed mostly on this negativity, when they start to become more positive, or at least balanced in their conversations with others, the people who were, kind of dwelling in the negativity with them, they either may have to shift to maintain the relationship going forward, or they might just sort of drop off because they're not ready to shift out of this negativity loop, you know. So, yeah. But anyway, the connections potentially would be closer, but also like more balanced over time for somebody who takes this remedy. So on this slide, again, I've done almost all the other remedies at this point. So, there's some other remedies that you can, think about too, that might be appropriate. And again, as I mentioned with the Bach Flower remedies, the magic happens is when you really understand the energy of the remedy, and then you really understand the energy of the person, and then you match them up. So it's really about understanding the subtle details of these remedies and the person, where you get the best results. So let's just talk about some of these here in terms of like why you might consider them. So there's like beech, uh, Bach flower, and that kind of person's like hypercritical or even judgmental. So this is slightly different because this tends to be more about people and groups and that sort of thing, more than just anything like the layout of a room or the furniture at an angle or something like this. So there is again a nuance here between beech and crabapple. Then cherry plum. Cherry plum might be a possibility because sometimes people go through all this energy of like focusing on details because it's kind of a distraction for themselves, almost kind of a smokescreen. Because the thing is that if they were to, whatever the deeper causes of that behavior, um, it might bring up, other negative thoughts or feelings that they don't really want to address. And so cherry plum is for somebody who fears going through a breakdown, even on a subconscious level, or we would even say like a healing crisis. Because the thing is, like, let's say that this person who's experiencing this behavior went through some abuse, and was, literally infused, different ways with these notions of living up to some, I don't know, random standard that somebody else set, like a parent or something like that, and really forced to adhere to it. Then if they address this behavior, then that's linked to what, initially caused the behavior. And that might open up a whole nother can of worms that on some level they're not ready to deal with. So cherry plum might be, a possibility. Chestnut bud's another one. That's for repeating the same mistakes over and over again. So, that might be again somebody who that tends to be a little bit more general, where they kind of get into the same situations. But somebody who's like more of a chestnut person, they won't necessarily show up with the negativity that crabapple will have. Then there's gentian, and these people are like skeptical, kind of, doubting types. Um, so that's a certain kind of, negativity as well. But this is more about like, considering or accepting ideas as opposed to like, again, focusing on details that are out of order. And then there can be Heather. Heather is for what we call, needy child, quote unquote. And this is for people who are actually attention seeking in kind of indirect ways. Again, they're usually older. They might be full-fledged adults or whatever, but they might get into behaviors like excessive talking or something like that, where you know the the, the reason for the talking, because people can talk excessively for different reasons. Sometimes it's anxiety of different kinds, but sometimes it's like there's some hole that they felt back in their childhood where they didn't get appropriate attention from their parents or something like that, and so they're sort of you know constantly living that out. So all of this like detail organizing and that kind of thing, um, it might be a type of attention-seeking behavior. Then there's Holly. Holly's for disappointment and distrust, and usually this is more about like relationships. So, but when I did Holly, I talked about how those sort of like Scrooge type person where they just don't give in relationships, which again is a kind of negativity, but it's more a specific type of negativity in terms of, they've been disappointed by people and don't trust, and so they've kind of closed down their heart and kind of won't participate in the cycle of giving with others. So it's, again, different. Then there's Larch. Larch is for people who, for some reason or other, have kind of internalized this inferiority complex. So they won't necessarily hyper focus on details and be negative, but large people won't necessarily put them in a position to move forward because they don't feel like they deserve it, or they feel like other people deserve it more than them. Pine can sort of be like a crabapple. Pine is for people who, feel like they've made mistakes in the past and they can't kind of forgive themselves for it. And so they kind of keep themselves suppressed from moving forward in life or being happy because of the mistake. But again, they don't necessarily come across as like, as being negative and, downer people and stuff like that. So again, similarities but differences as well. Then there's red chestnut. This can be like excessive worry for others, especially for people who are like helicopter parents and that sort of thing. Again, this tends to be more specific to worrying about other people, not necessarily themselves, not necessarily judging themselves, or you know, but they people who are caretaking of others might hyper focus on details of the caretaking. So that might be more of a red chestnut remedy. Then there's rock water. Rock water is for people who have a pretty rigid idea system. They won't necessarily come across as negative though. So again, there's that difference. Star of Bethlehem. This is for people who've been through some sort of trauma and shock, and then they kind of shut down. And then that shutdown might look like it might not be like they're sort of like literally not moving or talking. It can be, literally moving or talking or whatever and sitting on the couch, but or lying on the floor, but it can be this sort of the excessive hyper focusing on details might be a way of um, again following through or experiencing a full healing of some trauma from the past. And again, this might get into maybe childhood abuse or something like that. Then there's vine. A vine might seem, they might be critical of others and that sort of thing. But vine has this quality of like wanting to domineer people. I think the people who kind of respond to crabapple people's like, tiptoeing around them or maybe staying away or, trying to lift them up and get them to be more positive and stuff like that. Vine people are definitely about like trying to control people. I'm not sure that the thought about crabapple people is to control people. Um, they might end up doing so because there's this is so, hardcore of a behavior for them. Sometimes the only way other people have of engaging with them is to, again, tiptoe around or try to always, sort of cheerlead or whatever, 'cause they're so stuck in this pattern. Um, then there's walnut. Walnut can show up as like resistance to all kinds of different life transitions. So again, this kind of behavior might be sort of a distraction device or delay device or strategy, tactic. Again, even unconsciously, that's preventing somebody from moving into the next phase of their life. Then there's white chestnut, and this can be for like repetitive thoughts or like analysis paralysis. Um, but again, it doesn't necessarily have to show up as like negativity. Then there's wild oat, and this is for somebody who like lacks clarity of purpose. So again, all the nitpicking and the hyper focusing on details and things like that can be kind of a delay device or tactic or smokescreen for somebody who just doesn't really feel that engaged. And so they just sort of out of default they hyper focus on details that maybe are not so significant or meaningful because they just don't have something, a grander vision to focus on. So those are different Bach flower remedies and some of the, again, subtle differences. I think some other thoughts from other paradigms that might be helpful for somebody who's kind of going through this kind of energy, experiencing it. There is the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi. Sometimes introducing these concepts can be helpful as a different way of sort of breaking the mental patterns and cycles. So wabi-sabi is sort of like, you can loosely translate that as perfectly imperfect. And so, at least with Japanese culture, working with this concept helps to relieve this sort of really stringent, harsh, intense drive towards being perfect, and creating some space, mental, emotional, and spiritual space about, accepting the, quote unquote imperfections of life and within oneself. So it kind of takes the edge off of such a hard drive towards some sort of perfectionism. But from an Ayurveda point of view, which is traditional Indian medicine, people who would go through this kind of behavior, people who tend to focus on details in kind of a rigid way, that's usually an indication that there's like what we call high pitta or high fire for somebody. And also, like there might be some like fear associated with that, and the fear aspect and the kind of uh, constant movements, and activity could be an indication of high wind or vata. So this kind of behavior would be like a potentially high pitta, high vata type of energy. So again, if you're into Ayurveda. And then actually, even from a Vedic astrology point of view, um, for people who are into astrology, Mercury is usually the planet we associate with people who tend to focus on details. So there might be issues related to Mercury, like maybe it's combust or debilitated or something, or with a bunch of malefics. And then Mercury owns two houses or two constellations, rules two constellations. One of them is Virgo. And Virgo is known for, especially in the physical world, um, ordering their life and ordering things around them. So when they get out of sorts, when things aren't in order. So, it could be somebody's like a Virgo ascendant, who tend towards this kind of behavior. And then also Rahu and Ketu, the nodes of the moon, they can bring in energy of like obsessive compulsive behavior. So if Rahu and Ketu are in Virgo or with Mercury, that might bring this kind of hyper obsessive, you know, um, attention to details to somebody's life, it just astrologically speaking. So, again, I'm just offering different paradigms and, ways that they think about this kind of behavior and ways to maybe help somebody with it. All right, so I think that might be it. So thanks so much for stopping by and listening to one of my talks. Hope you found it helpful and useful and interesting. I have some books that I've written on natural medicine. Copies of them can be found on Amazon.com. I do have an online art gallery and gift shop, except for the photo on the first slide. The other photos are ones I've taken. So a lot of my photography's on that site if you want to check those out. Check out my artwork there. And then I do have another YouTube channel on Vedic astrology called Light Vedic Astrology. For those of you who are interested in that, it's Vedic astrology is the astrology of ancient India, so it's more than 5,000 years old, and it's quite a bit different than Western astrology. So, yeah, so a lot of resources out there for you. All right. So, take good care, and until the next one. Namaste.